They are struggling to keep the lights on in Cuba. Earlier this year, the country lost access to Venezuelan oil following the U.S. intervention in Caracas. The island has suffered a series of power blackouts, exacerbating an ongoing economic crisis there. Well, now Washington is turning up the pressure on the island's communist leadership. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio on Tuesday dismissed the latest reforms on the island. He says allowing exiles to invest in businesses will not fix what he calls a broken system. On Monday, Havana held the reforms, which allow Cubans abroad to invest in and to own businesses on the island. Rubio says the changes are not nearly enough. And President Trump, he's signaling that he is not done with Cuba.
I do believe I'll be having the honor of taking Cuba. That'd be good. That's a big honor.
Taking Cuba.
Taking Cuba in some form, yeah. Taking Cuba. I mean, whether I free it, take it, I think I could do anything I want with it. You want to know the truth? They're a very weakened nation.
And for more now, I'm joined by Andres Petiera. He's a historian specializing in Cuba at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the United States. Andres, it's good to have you with us. You know, the U.S. president, he has made it clear, saying that he could sweep in and take Cuba if he wants to. Now, I've heard his words described today as hyper hubris, signs of a megalomaniac, also words of wise foreign policy. What is your take?
My first reaction was to feel like if this was coming out of a writer's room for a made-for-TV movie or something, it would have gotten nixed as being too over the top. The idea that Cuba can be just taken is not really in line with how the U.S. has usually approached the topic of Cuba, because the Cuban government has it wouldn't last in a conventional war, but it's been preparing for a guerrilla war for decades. Mm-hmm. So it's not really a soft target in the traditional sense. But what's more, it's kind of absurd in another sense that it's actually feeding the official Cuban government's line on what the U.S. has always been about. Oh, they've always been about taking our island. They don't care about human rights here, all that stuff, which has then been used to then suppress dissidents and all the rest in Cuba. So it's an incredibly weird strategic decision.
Andres, do you think, though, that the people of Cuba, do you think they believe what the regime is telling them, that this proves that the U.S. is all about taking control of us?
It's really hard to tell because Cuba is not like a traditional open society. You don't really have open expressions of information. I don't think that people take the government line, most like everyday people take the government line seriously anymore. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there is, number one, a solid core of support of a fraction of the population, but a strong fraction. And on the other hand, I don't think that most Cubans are entirely naive about who Trump is. Okay. They have there's a long history of the U.S. imposing sanctions, and the current oil blockade is not exactly a soft touch. So,
yeah, let me ask you about these power blackouts. We know that they've been plaguing Cuba for many months now. The island just recovered from the latest major outage today. How much of this can be attributed to the U.S. oil embargo?
So it's more like if there's a person who was on dialysis and then they also got punched in the kidney, if that helps. So Cuba has had multiple blackouts. This is number 7, and the previous ones were before the current oil blockade. So it's not at core because of that. The problem is the electrical infrastructure is from the Soviet era. Mm-hmm. The issue is that Cuba doesn't have enough money to import enough fuel. The issue is that they're using domestic crude, which has a lot of impurities, which then clogs up the power plants. The electrical grid as well for the distribution of the power is also very old and obsolete and has 1,000 problems. So it's more like an already ailing system, and then you get sucker punched on top of that. That's what the oil blockade has done, and it's kind of pushing the system to a breaking point.
You mentioned the Soviets Russia, Cuba may be getting a helping hand from Russia, according to comments that are coming from the Kremlin. I want you to take a listen to what spokesman Dmitry Peskov said in a rare televised address. Take a listen.
Cuba is an independent sovereign state that's facing great economic difficulties due to the suffocating embargo that's been imposed on the country. Major humanitarian problems are developing there. And of course, we as Russia are ready to provide all possible assistance. All these issues are being worked out with our Cuban counterparts.
Andres, Vladimir Putin, he has been very critical of the U.S. suffocating Cuba. Those are his words. Could Russia step in to help Cuba ward off the U.S.? And what would this mean then for relations between Moscow and Washington?
I'm kind of reluctant to take the Russians at their word because you've seen them kind of step back from the brink when other regimes that they've supported and had much more of a vested interest in, and which could pay them back in various ways, including with oil, have collapsed in the last year or two. Like, look at the Assad regime in Syria, look at Maduro with Venezuela. Iran is also, as I understand it, kind of frustrated that the Russians aren't stepping up as much as the Iranian regime expected. And so the Russians are talking a good game, but I will take them seriously when they go beyond just words, basically. I'm also not entirely clear that the Russians want to do this, right? Because it would mean not just a ratcheting up of tensions with the US, but also it would be an overextension of their military, which already has really big commitments in Ukraine for obvious reasons. It has other economic obligations. And also Cuba is a black pit for money since the Soviet era. The Soviets were subsidizing Cuba to the tune of billions a year. I think it's partly why China doesn't want to step up to the plate, and they've been begging Cuba to reform its economy. Right. So, why would Russia want to take on that sugar daddy role?
Yeah, I was going to ask you, Trump's foreign policy is targeting areas where China has been expanding its influence, Venezuela, Iran, Cuba. Do you see Trump here trying to weaken China's strategy?
Weaken China's strategy vis-a-vis
other countries. I'm thinking about any country in Central America, Latin America, that Trump would see as a violation of the Monroe Doctrine and the Dunroe Doctrine, as he calls it now.
Yeah, I do think that there is kind of a Godfather-esque. You've seen the ending of the Godfather movies. Kind of tying up of loose ends under the the Trump administration at present. And the problem is that, number one, it's not entirely clear how successful the strategy is, especially long term. And then number two, one of the reasons that Latin America is kind of on fire for much of the Cold War is because attempts at more democratic, peaceful institutional reforms and changes are frustrated, and the U.S. is seen as this aggressor and major intervening and meddling power, and that kind of just supercharges more extreme elements in the region. So the U.S. can force countries to cut China off and keep it out of the hemisphere in the short term, but then that's going to have blowback because the countries are going to be like, okay, this is not an acceptable solution long term. We're going to start working together and seeing how we can get more distance and independence from Washington.
Andres Peteira, good talking with you. We appreciate your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.